All right, here's the second lesson of Unit 2, Farmers' Responses to Their Economic Challenges. We talked about 10 of them, and we talked about which ones were maybe the most significant and which ones might be the ones that may perhaps alleviate some of the other problems to the economic stress of the farmers. It's important to note that the most dominant piece of the economy at this time still is connected to farming and agriculture. A majority of the population at this time, after the Civil War and leading up to the Civil War, still lives in rural areas. And these economic challenges that we discussed here are going to bring farmers together, which largely in past history is a split up and unconnected kind of a group. And there is going to be a political formation that happens here after the Civil War with the economic stress that develops. This time period is also known as, or has a characteristic of, a crusade, a religious kind of a movement that is connected to and has definitions of good versus bad behind it in terms of fighting one side versus another, industry versus farmers, and farmers saying industry and the government are the problem and also need to be the solution, that kind of thing. And this crusade is going to result in some significant change in economic thinking and political thinking that has dominated American political thought and life up until this point in time. That is laissez-faire. It's going to shift, or ask government to shift its role in the economy and in politics gradually over time. And it's going to begin here with the Granger movement, farm alliances. It's going to move into that, and then the populist party formation that will be the culmination of this new third political party that is going to pressure government to start taking control of things to make the lives of people, workers, laborers in factories, but especially for farmers, better, and to protect them from forces that are hurting them. What best describes laissez-faire? Best answer is A, right? Non-interference in the economy, but also politically. Think Thomas Jefferson. This chart shows the economic changes that are going on in the post-Civil War time period, 1865 and all the way up to about 1900. There are a series of panics that are very significant here for farmers, and farming becomes less and less profitable, right? Decent prices here in the blue, but it starts to decline here as time goes on. And we'll talk about why some of that happens. This image portrays the group that is most significant for the beginning of this movement. It's called the Patrons of Husbandry. If you're into husbandry, it means you're into cattle and you're into farming and into propagating agricultural goods and animals and growing animals for profit and for sale and that kind of thing, or for subsistence. But when we talk about farming in the West compared to farming in the Northeast and farming in the South and the West, it's really not just about subsistence. It's about growing something for profit, something to sell. In 1867, a couple years after the end of the Civil War, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry is formed, and it becomes dominant and spreads into the Midwestern states of Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. In fact, it is, hooray, having roots in Minnesota. This guy by the name of Oliver Hudson Kelly is the founder of it, and the Oliver Kelly farm can still be seen north of Minneapolis around Elk River, Minnesota. It was an early day farm out in the prairies of Minnesota and the unsettled regions of Minnesota that he establishes and buys and turns into kind of a scientific experiment in how to be better at growing things in the Western territories, pre-Civil War and after the Civil War. But this guy decides that there needs to be some sort of organization for farmers to help them be more connected. It actually is not political to begin with. In its beginnings, it is a situation where it is about getting some sort of social connectivity for farmers. They have dances, they have social gatherings. Pardon the typo right here. Self-help kind of a scenario is happening here. It's also one in which decisions in their local governing groups are made in a very egalitarian way. Women had a lot of input and say in who was elected particular leaders and Grange area leaders and leadership and that kind of thing, and setting up gatherings and setting up dances and things like that. If you think about it, farmers are very spread out and very disconnected. They don't get a lot of interaction. Their jobs are basically 24/7, and so they need some of that interaction. They're isolated, especially out in the far reaches of the West, as we saw at the last lesson. And so they're really trying to bring a social connection together. And, you know, they have sons and daughters, and they want them to meet other sons and daughters and to marry and to have families and be successful in life also. They're also going to be dominantly known for the establishment of something called cooperatives. It's important to know this. You notice the root word here, circle, cooperate. Remember Sesame Street? Some of those little skits, cooperate. Well, basically these cooperatives are going to be formed like little stores for farmers so that they can fix one of the problems they had, and that was to cut out the middleman. Basically set up a store run by farmers, not for profit, find resources and goods that farmers need, and charge just enough to make the store successful and to continue to operate and pay the people that operate it, but get a cheaper price. This is a big deal. And so they're actually trying to cut out the middleman in an industry that is, in their mind, costing them more and gouging them for higher prices for the goods they need. But when we get to some economic distress in 1873, the Panic of 1873, and other panics that come up, they become more organized and start saying, hey, why don't we as a group start petitioning our legislators, our governor, to do some things to help protect us? They start electing state officers and state and representatives, and they start passing things called Granger laws, laws that promote farm interests. And these particular laws are pretty much directed at, make sure you note this off to the side, these particular laws are directed at what we looked at in our political cartoon, regulating railroads, especially railroads. That is the one thing that everybody in the country relied on for their goods and resources, especially farmers. In and out, they relied on those things. And they charged them too much in their mind. And so they start passing laws that limit or allow states to limit how much railroads could charge. It goes to the Supreme Court in Munn versus Illinois, 1877. Private property of railroads, the Supreme Court said, was subject to the regulation of states and state laws when it was devoted to the public interest. However, we get about not quite 10 years later, it goes to the Supreme Court again. Notice where it's at, Illinois. Wabash versus Illinois case. Supreme Court flips that decision and says, no, states cannot, Granger laws cannot be passed to limit railroads, because it says specifically, strictly, directly in words, it is enumerated in there that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. And what are railroads? They are a piece of a company that is operating commercially, selling stuff across state lines, interstates between states, and therefore states cannot regulate it. It has to be regulated by the federal government. Crazy that they supported it in 1877, earlier in 1877 and all, but basically the Granger laws are unconstitutional. Well, despite that, everybody says, or the Grangers say, okay, let's lobby the federal government to set up a regulatory agency, and here it is, the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's still around today. It's set up to regulate railroads and railroad rates. It wasn't that effective. It didn't have a lot of power, but it's there, and it will become more powerful later on in the future. So, win-loss kind of a scenario for farmers. So from farmers to political party, what happens here over time is that our Grangers kind of fade away, and what develops in the South and the West are a series of farmers' alliances. And they're very much similar to the Grangers, except they're bigger and larger in number. They're regional networks of farmers that are kind of social gatherings and social organizations to begin with. They were developing a little bit about the same time in a way, but to really get strong after the Grange movement. And they eventually formed to join this thing called a National Alliance, the National Alliance of Farmers. And you notice that there are some in the South and some in the West. Well, in the South, there's kind of a split between these alliances. There is a Farm Alliance of Free African American Farmers, and then there's Farm Alliances of white Southern farmers. And those two groups never really gelled together, and that's going to be kind of a problem for the Farm Alliance, farm populist movement that's developing here. It won't necessarily come together as powerfully or successfully as it could the Westerners versus the Southerners getting together, or even Northern Farmer Alliances, Granger-type minded people joining together and supporting the same ideas because of the race issue. And so these alliances will get together and start making some of these demands to limit and regulate not only railroads and big business, bankers, the middleman, ask government to take the power, right? Reduction of laissez-faire to go ahead and change the system and to put limits and rules and regulations on big business and industry to protect the little guy, to protect the farmer, again, a big, massive part of the population and the economy. They're going to ask for that to happen, and they're going to ask for that to happen, and when it doesn't happen, they're going to get together in a place called Ocala. Yes, that is Ocala, Florida, if you would go ahead and note that there for yourself. And the government is going to be asked in a series of requests that they're going to present that government takes actions for the economy and for political reform. Right? So it goes from economic regulation to one in which there is request for political reform, and this is connected to the corruption that we saw and the point of view that there is a significant amount of corruption in industry and in government, between government and industry. It's a big theme that we're going to carry forward to the Industrial Revolution, which we are in at this time. There's a lot of layers here. We're in the Industrial Revolution, 1865. In 1890, the elections of that year, alliance leaders pushed for these reforms at the state and the federal level. It doesn't happen. Then they get more upset and more organized, and in 1892, in Omaha, Nebraska, the Populist Party is formed. So what you're going to be doing here at this point is going into your guided reading and completing a Venn diagram which compares the Ocala demands to the Populist Party platform and looking for the similarities and differences between those things. There are going to be largely similarities and differences politically and economically. And some of these things, it's important to remember, are going to be carrying forward to the future. We'll see that they don't necessarily happen successfully to a large degree, but the ideas are not going to die. And there's going to be continued requests for these changes. And we'll talk about when they kind of die and fade away for a while, but they're kind of laying around latently a little bit in the soil, so to speak. Like that one, in the soil. Yeah. It's going to come around when there's more economic stress. And that is going to be our Great Depression, when we see economic stress happening at the Great Depression, starting in 1920 and 1930, and even other economic stress periods before that. We'll talk about those after World War I and things like that. More of these ideas and things come back, and gradually laissez-faire and government is going to regulate industry, regulate the economy, regulate big business more and more, and come up with some political reforms to get rid of the corruption and establish more power to the people. Remember populism? Who's controlling things? The idea is that big business is really controlling the vote of our federal government officials, and it's not your common vote that matters. It's going to change a lot. So, this is where you will go ahead, transition into the Ocala demands and the Populist Party platforms, read through that closed reading, then complete this more simplified graphic organizer for it. We'll quiz on this next class, and there'll be a videocast quiz on lesson 3 and a videocast for home learning over the weekend. That's it. And literally we should be saying, make hay. Have you got hay? If you've got hay, it means your work is done in your notebook and you have no Z's in the grade book. Make hay. Ask questions if you have them. We'll review more in the future. Set, go.